Hey guys, I'm here with a special video on a topic that I'm super passionate about. This has been a long time coming, and that topic is deck building, specifically building new decks. And I don't mean like building a deck that no one's ever seen before or anything like that. I mean new to you. So maybe you're looking for something to play that you haven't played before, or maybe you've abandoned a deck in the past and you want to start fresh with it. That being said, with a new set on the horizon, especially with the competitive season following, being able to build and optimize new decks efficiently can be really powerful and can give you an edge in tournaments and events. It will help you top more reliably if you do it correctly. The beginning of a format is when good deck builders shine. Outside of that though, I mean, I get bored playing the same decks a lot, and a lot of people do. That's fair enough. The other benefit I want to bring up is a big one as well. Playing lots of new decks and lots of different decks, it gives you a lot of experience with the card pool and gives you a much wider knowledge of the cards and what they do. But not just that, it also gives you more experience with the way they interact and their strengths and their weaknesses. So when you come up against something that most people would be unfamiliar with, you're much more likely to quickly identify what it's trying to do, and then you can play accordingly. So even if you end up playing a standard meta deck yourself, so none of your deck ideas ended up being, good enough to take to an event, so you play a meta deck, even if that happens, having played all those decks, it gives you the knowledge and experience that can prevent you from getting blindsided or just randomly sniped by a weird deck or interactions and cards that you haven't seen before, because now you probably have seen them before. Lastly, I should put this disclaimer: this is just my method, right? There's no definitive method for building a new deck. I would never be like, your deck is worse because you didn't use this method or anything like that. Of course not. As always, I'm just giving my perspective, and if you find that helpful or not, obviously I hope you do. Anyway, without further ado, here's an outline. So this is just 5 steps. Number 1, find something unfair. Number 2, add cards that directly support it and cards that work well with it. Number 3, fill the backups. Number 4, add good generic cards. And number 5, cover the weaknesses and fill holes. I'm going to go through these steps in detail, and then we're going to build a deck together using this method. But starting with number 1, find something unfair. This is usually what makes or breaks a deck, like whether that deck is viable, basically. It can be a single card, it can be a combo, or it can even be an entire archetype. There's really no limit on how many cards are involved in something unfair. What is unfair? Unfair is basically a card or interaction which is of a noticeably higher power level than average. So it must be unfair enough that when it's doing what you intended, it significantly increases your chances of winning. So here are some examples of unfair things. So the card is, or the interaction is incredibly CP efficient. So the card or ability is basically worth more than its cost. So Pain and Layla, easy examples. Pain basically costs -2. You're literally just gaining a forward on the field out of nowhere for nothing. Layla is basically 2 bodies for 0 CP, which is very good. 3 board presence times 2. That's very, very strong. For Sawyer, it goes a little bit the other way. So the value in for Sawyer is that each time you use it, you're paying 1 CP. So assuming you're removing something, you've paid 1 CP. Whatever you removed, you've taken away however much that forward cost, as well as the 2 CP for the forward card itself. So pretty much most of the time, your Fossoya is gaining you a bunch of CP values. So it's very efficient. Another way things can be unfair is if they break the rules. Alisei, normally your forwards have to wait a turn to attack, right? Some decks might have a couple haste here or there. Alisei means your entire deck can attack the turn they enter, which is not, you don't normally have to play against that. So that's one way to break the rules. Snow is another good example. Basically removes combat from the game. So once you've played Snow, your opponent basically can never block you again. So that's removed an entire mechanic. The other one is if it prevents your opponent from playing the game. And fortunately, this is not common in this game. Gesper got banned, fair enough. Emperor was in the past, it was like this. Because back then, many elements didn't have a good way to remove it, or even a way to remove it at all. So it could just sit there and turn off like a bunch of your deck, and there's nothing you could do about it. Whereas now, we have plenty of ways to remove Emperor. Most elements can do that now quite easily. And he's, you know, if he gets removed, it's not really worth it because it's like a hard 4 cost. He hasn't gained any value. So that's fine. Dudaluma I've put with an asterisk because he kind of fits in two categories. He's really efficient, but also it's so efficient that it does kind of prevent your opponent playing. Basically, at a point, once you have Dudaluma and once you have a certain setup, your opponent can basically never play forwards again because every time they do, it just gets removed straight away for nothing. So with that, you know, that knowledge of what can be unfair, I urge you to go look through, you know, Mognet, look through your physical cards. Just go find, like, look at cards, read them, think about their effects, think if you can find a way to make it, you know, be super efficient or, you know, break some rules, stop your opponent doing something, like, you know, just look for cards that do cool things that seem good to you. Even if they seem a little bit far out, you know, just find something that, you know, you can be like, I want that, I want to do that. Like, you know, that seems like it'd be sick, you know, I feel like I would get a lot of value out of that or whatever. But just some notes when you actually do test your deck. Sometimes something you thought would be unfair turns out too fair. And in my opinion, a good example is Deleter and Layla. This was like a combo that a lot of people, when Layla was first revealed, thought would be pretty good. You've got you generate a 4 cost and a 3 cost body for basically 0 CP, like I said before. And so those are two of the most common costs. So Deleter can take one of those 0 cost bodies, throw it away, and kill something that's like a decent cost and gain a bunch of value out of that. And that is like decent, but it turns out that's pretty much the only unfair-ish thing that Water and Earth can do. And even that itself is semi-situational. Like, you know, you've got 3 different parts of that combo are needed. I mean, the Viking can be in your break zone, so that's not a huge deal. But you still have to have the Layla and the Deleter. And then, of course, yeah, Water and Earth together. And Alex Hancock wrote an article about, like, building this deck and discovering this. That those elements together actually don't really have much to do that's unfair at all. It really ends up just quite average and, like, generally not worth pursuing with the versions that we've tried anyway. Mega Chocobo is one that I personally thought would be quite unfair. I thought, you know, we've got a forward that can attack every turn, kill something for free every turn, potentially, and, you know, ice can dull things easily, so that's like, this should be fine, right? It's untargeted by summons as well, but in testing, I, you know, played it a bunch, and it just turned out that it just didn't work out as well as I'd hoped. Like, just, it didn't quite work the way I intended it to. It was, you know, a few too many, like, you know, holes in the plan kind of thing. So that's an example from my perspective that's happened. And sometimes you want to build a deck based around an idea, but the idea isn't unfair enough to win reliably in a competitive environment. So this is more that you want to build a deck. Instead of going, I'm going to find something unfair, you've gone, well, I like this thing, I just want to build around this. And 2 common examples of this are Knights and Guardians. So that, you know, it's fair enough someone's like, oh, I want to build a Knights deck, or I want to build a Guardians deck. And, like, sure, go ahead, but they don't have anything unfair to do. So they're basically just a bunch of, you know, average bodies, maybe a little bit larger sometimes, maybe protected sometimes, but they don't really do anything. They don't do anything unfair. They're just decent bodies, and that's not enough to win a game these days. You know, the power level that we have, you know, all the other unfair things that other decks can do, you know, once the opposing deck starts doing whatever they do that's actually unfair and good, your average deck that doesn't have those won't be able to keep up. You know, won't have a win condition, basically. So if you ever feel like, if you ever built these decks and you've felt like you're not having much success and, you know, you don't see them top events often, if ever, that is probably why. Last thing, average power level increases as more sets come out. That's power creep. That's why some things which are unfair at first disappear from the meta, even though the cards themselves don't change. Perfect example of this is Golbez. He is, you know, was nuts in Opus 1 and 2, like really good. Golbez decks were everywhere. There was a solid deck that was quite strong. You know, over time, and Golbez hasn't changed. Like, it's still the same card. In fact, we've actually got more, like lots more targets for it now. But the actual power level of the card hasn't really changed. Whereas the average power level of the game has basically caught up. So now, resolving a Golbez isn't good enough to justify the inconsistencies in the deck. You know, that's, other decks can do things that are just as good without having such an inconsistent deck. And Locke was a good example in Opus 4 and 5. This is after Golbez's time. You know, in Opus 4, Locke, Setzer, like that engine was really good because you have these forwards, these persistent bodies, and this one that's threatening damage all the time and gaining the, you know, the discard effect, getting the free CP out of that. Whereas now we have quite a few forwards that can kind of gain free CP or are efficient to play even without the needing 2 other 6 characters. So the other cards have caught up to him, so now he's not used as much because of that. Now, step 2. Add support. First step's really easy. Add cards that directly support your unfair thing. 90% of the time, that just translates to put in the searches. It can also, though, extend to revival or additional copies for an S ability. So simple examples, Bran, searches, Viking for Layla. Devout can be used to, bring out stuff like Renoa or Terran.Illuma, that kind of stuff. There aren't any good examples of the S ability currently, although in the past we've had stuff like Cloud and Vincent. Often we've seen a 4th or 5th copy of those names in the deck just for the special ability. If there was another card named Illua currently, then we would definitely see those in a deck with the reg just to support the Illua that we have. Secondly, add cards that protect it or help you do it more reliably. There aren't always options here, but here are some options in some cases. It's kind of redundant putting Ishtola here because she's always going to be added in step 4 anyway, but in future, if for whatever reason she is not some really good staple card, then she will still be an option at this step as a way to protect certain setups. I put a buff back up there because the buff backups can actually be really useful and important to protect certain forwards who don't have the right power, basically. So 7,000 is the example at the moment, basically. 7,000 is quite easy to do efficiently currently. So forwards that you pay for with 7k or less power are often not that good to play, and you can often get punished for doing that. So if your deck relies on a forward like Sarah or Locke and Setzer, this is maybe another reason why Locke and Setzer have fallen out of it, then having a way to buff them from 7k to 8k actually does make them a lot more reliable and a lot better. So that's why Duke Lag is there. Obviously, other buff backups, same thing. They don't have to be the element ones. Arc can buff your standard units out of range of getting pinged, for example. Goblin I've put there as an example because if we get a forward or an unfair thing that relies on attacking or using a dull ability, then giving that haste makes it a lot more reliable and a lot better because you can do it straight away. You don't have to telegraph it. And Goblin is currently the most efficient, most reliable way to give something haste. The best example we have already is Varn. He actually is really good with haste. So unfortunately, Goblin's in fire and Varn himself is quite inefficient. But there's definitely a deck you can build out of that and it can definitely win because Varn can be very unfair. The rest of this step is incredibly broad, and this is the part of the deck that will change the most as you play it. So I'll just give you some attributes to consider. Cards that benefit from the card that you've already added. So that includes additional search options for searches. So say you've put in Mog 13, so you can search Sarah. You'd be like, well, Sid Reigns is a pretty good 13 character. I can chuck him in as well. He's searchable. Cards that support the cards you've already added without necessarily supporting the unfair thing. So I talked about direct support before. This is more indirect support, basically. And cards that typically work well with the cards that you've already added. This step cascades really easily. So, I mean, the more cards you add, then the more cards you can consider as well, because you've got more cards in there now, you've got more things that benefit from those cards. You've got more cards to support, you have more cards that could work well with the cards that you're playing. And so that means often after this step you can end up with too many cards even. You can end up with a lot of cards in your deck, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but of course, never be afraid to cut cards. And even though this is listed as step 2, you don't have to complete it straight away. So you will naturally think of more cards for this step as you complete the other steps. And like I said, never feel bad cutting cards. Sometimes your direction or your perspective changes while you're building, or you just think about a card more and realize it's maybe not for you, or maybe it's not as good as you thought it might be. In fact, I actually look forward to, or I appreciate when I notice a card that I want to cut because it means I get more space. It means I get, to try other things. So yeah, don't be afraid to cut cards. These 2 steps basically form the core of your deck. But yeah, talking about elements though, so taking a break from the steps for a second, most people consider 2 main categories, mono and dual. That's fair enough. So if this is like a line of 50 cards or whatever, Mono decks, obviously at the top, 50 of the same color, or, light and dark kind of offset these a bit, but it doesn't really change the dynamics. That's not important. Duels, you stick around the 22 to 28 mark. You generally don't want to go like into like 19, 20 type thing, because then you probably don't have enough of that element, and maybe it'll be hard for you to play the cards from there sometimes. I put to you, though, that there is a third distinct category, the mono splash, which is basically a mono deck splashing another element. And that sits around here, like the 25%, like, 9 to 15 mark. So you can have a mostly mono deck with maybe like 9 to 15-ish cards from a different element if you particularly want something from that element. Pros and cons, mono is obviously maximum consistency, and it's the easiest to optimize because it has the smallest card pool. But that also means that it's the least flexible and it's the most telegraphed. So mono decks often will end up looking pretty similar because the card pool's so small and it's so easy to optimize. Then it's fairly solved most of the time, and that also means that your opponent can it's predictable. Your opponent will generally know what the mono deck can do because most mono decks do similar things, and you obviously have access to your mono specific power cards, which is that is an important benefit for some cards like Cagnazzo, Orphan to an extent, Bart's, that kind of stuff. Dual decks, obviously the opposite. They are much less consistent, but they have access to a lot more powerful synergies, and they're much more flexible. So you have a lot more options, and that not only means that you have more options for your deck, it also means your opponent is less likely to predict what you can do. You can throw them off a lot easier. There'll be things that you can catch people unexpectedly with. And it's less solved, so they're less likely to have seen a deck like it before. It's less telegraphed, etc. Mono Splash tries to take a decent amount of the consistency from mono, but give you access to usually one powerful cross-element synergy. A simple example is Dataluma in Ice with Terra. So Terra, you need a lot of Ice CP, so her ability can be used a lot of times. If you have a Dataluma with that Terra, then you can ping 4k to things, and that's really potent. That's a lot stronger than what Ice can normally do. But to splash it, you have to play a few other Earth cards or whatever. You still have access to your mono-specific power cards, like Orphan in this example is still good because you're still likely to have 5 Ice backups. Although in the other examples with like Cagnazzo and Bart's, for example, they might be a little bit weaker because you usually have one backup of the different element there or whatever. And usually because the splash element's harder to access, you need a searcher of that element. For the splash element of the mono element. And in the case of Ice with Earth, you'd be playing the Earth Flan with Ice Flan, and that would be your way to search the Earth CP. But the reason I bring that up, I'm not trying to be like, oh, you should all try this crazy new deck type, whatever. No, nothing like that. I'm just bringing it up to you as an option, so you know that when you're building your deck and you've got this unfair thing, maybe you found a synergy you want that's across 2 elements, you don't necessarily have to then grab 20 other cards from that element. And I'm looking at you, Fire, basically. If I want 1 card from Fire, I probably don't want 20 cards from Fire because there aren't that many good cards in Fire. But that aside, this is not an element discussion video. Anyway, just so you know, that is an option. I'm not saying it's some heaps good option or anything like that. It's, it just depends on what you're building, but yeah. Back to the steps. Step 3. Now that you know what elements you're playing, you can fill your backup line. And I generally stick to a 17-12 as a basis, and that's the minimums. So 17 to 20 backups total, usually 17 or 18, and I include at least 12 turn 1 or semi-turn 1 backups. Turn 1 backups are backups that the natural effective cost is 2. So that's either actual 2 cost, or a 4 cost with a search, a 4 cost with a draw, 4 cost draw 2 discard 1, all of that kind of stuff. Effective cost is 2, that's ideal on turn 1. Semi-turn 1 backup, either neutral 4 CPs, so you generally don't want to go into those turn 1 if you can avoid it, because it means you're investing more, which means you have less options in the first few turns, but that's still fine, it's still efficient at least. The other option is odd cost backups that are effectively 2 CP if you overpay them. So they're fine. These 2 versions of backups are fine on turn 1 if you don't have an ideal one. And that's generally your 3 cost searches or your evokers. 12, at least 12 turn 1 backups might sound a little bit above what most people aim for, but I will explain that on the next slide. If you need a higher amount of non-turn 1 backups, it's better to play more total backups than less turn 1 backups. So say you're playing Modern Water and you wanted to play 3 for Sawyer, 3 Waka, and 2 Minwo. So that's 8 non-turn 1 backups. I would be more compelled to play 20 total backups so I can keep 12 turn 1 backups rather than cut into them and play only 10 turn 1 backups and 8 of the non-turn 1 backups. The reasoning is, so obviously the reasoning against playing more total backups is that you're more likely to draw lots of backups, and later in the game, drawing backups can be dead, they can be bricks, and that can, prevent you from playing a turn, basically. The drawbacks of less turn 1 backups is that you have a lower chance of opening a backup turn 1. And if I have those two options, given those two options, I would always rather have the chance of drawing dead backups later than less chance of opening a backup turn 1. There are multiple reasons for that. Firstly, turn 1 is arguably the most important turn in the game. It is, if you miss your backup turn 1, you create a lot of loss conditions for yourself. So basically you normally have to play a forward instead. If they remove that forward efficiently, then you probably lose. If they open fine and you can't put enough damage pressure on them, then they'll probably be able to stabilize and then outvalue you because you didn't open enough backup. You didn't open backup, so you're wasting more CP basically. And the other thing is, because you probably have to push for damage, EXs completely screw you. So if you get hit by a removal EX and you had a bad start, you probably just lose on the spot. Even some search and draw EXs, the free cards they get, might just let them win anyway. So that's really not ideal. And there's nothing you can do about that in game. Like, you cannot decide what cards to open turn 1. If you draw no turn 1 backup, there was nothing you could have done differently in that game to prevent that. Outside the game, of course, in deck building, you could have mitigated that. Whereas having too many backups, you can play in a way and, plan around that possibility of drawing those, bricks, or trying to avoid drawing them or mitigate the impact by the way you play. So if you're playing more backups, for example, you could maybe ditch backups more liberally early. So, you could ditch a backup that you intend to play in 2 turns time because you're probably going to see another backup by then. Or you sculpt your hand in a way that you have forwards to play if you don't want to lock your backups up too early. That's all things you have control over. You have an element of control over whether that will affect you or not. Whereas drawing no backups turn 1, you can't control that outside of deck building. And that is why the main reason I favor having more turn 1 backups and more total backups rather than less and less. That's me. Other people might have different opinions. That's all good. On to ratios. Avoid playing 3 of a backup unless it's one of these, either multi-unit, core to the strategy, you want it as early as possible, or if it's a real EX. Those 4 categories. If you're playing 3 of a backup and it's not in one of those 4 categories, I would strongly consider lowering this ratio, maybe to 2 or potentially 1. And I'm not saying always play 3 of multi-units and always play 3 of the X's. Just the other 2, I probably would most of the time play 3. So if you have a backup that's core to your strategy or a backup that you want as early as possible, I probably would play 3 of those, although it's not 100% necessary. But yeah, you don't want to have too much, flooding of the same names, basically. You want to be able to, as you draw your backups, you want to be able to play them. As for dual decks, backups in dual decks, usually for regular dual color decks, you aim for like half-half, like 9 and 9 or 9 and 8 or whatever. I would almost never stray too far from that unless you have ways to search and manipulate the backups you have. But among the odd cost backups, I would try to have some from each element if possible, because most common turn 1 play a backup pass. If you can play a backup turn 1 pass and then turn 2 play the other color backup efficiently, that's like ideal. You get 2 backups turn 1 and you stay efficient. So similarly, turn 1 backups with a hard cost of 4 or 6, like Minfury and Larsa, they're slightly more valuable in dual decks because you can play it as a naked 2 CP off 2 backups of the other element. That's like kind of niche. It sounds kind of niche, but it actually does come up quite a bit. And I'm not making a huge deal out of it. So I'm not trying to be like, this is some hell important point. I'm just going to bring it up because maybe something you don't think about. The reason I put Kolka there as an example. So I'm not saying, 4-cost, 6-cost backups are like way better in duel. Like, there's so much better or anything like that. No, I'm saying if you're choosing between which backups to, fill out your slots with, and it happens a lot in Earth because besides Minor and Ophelia, most of Earth's backups are average at best. So there really is nothing that compels you to play one over the other. So if I was choosing between, say, Kolka and Carbuncle, if it was a dual color deck, I would choose the Kolka on the basis that, on this point where if I have, say, if I'm playing like Earth Fire, and I have 2 Fire backups, those are my first 2 backups, I can then ditch an Earth card, play the Kolka on that board, and use my mana efficiently while playing a 2-cost backup for turn. I have to invest more to use all my mana and also get the backup out. Last thing, a few forwards are fine to play first turn if you don't have a turn 1 backup. There's actually not many. This is almost all of them. But that may allow you to play a slightly lower count. But that's mainly 0-cost forwards. So Realm, Izana, Zapped, Babbliz, and Frit. The other ones are Layla with Viking and Moogle, the 4-cost Moogle that draws when it enters and when it dies. The last one is Porom. Mainly because even I don't condone playing a 2 CP 5k turn 1, but the reason Porom is alright is because you've clearly got not an optimal start if you have to play Porom turn 1, but at least then it gives you options to fix your hand for next turn and later on. So that's okay. Moving on to step 4. Add generic good cards. This is really easy. Just add the cards for your elements that are really good. There's some examples. Ilua is another example. I don't need to go into detail on that. You can literally look up FF decks, just look up like any decks and most of these cards will be in there. Like just find the ones that are in every single deck. Step 5. Cover weaknesses and fill holes, if there's space left. Sometimes there's not at this point, but there often is a few slots left. So if you can think of any noticeable weaknesses in your deck, try to find some cards that mitigate them. So if a Zidane will literally brick wall you because it's untargetable by abilities, then consider playing a summon that targets it. Or AoE damage, maybe a combat trick, or something like that. Aggro is a big one. So if your deck is kind of set-up-y, so you need to get some stuff set up before you can really develop the board and that kind of thing, do you have some way to punish your opponent for just playing a bunch of guys and turning them sideways? And if you don't, then you might have to consider including something. Another AoE, again, is good against that, but also efficient cards that punish dull forwards. Ice is good at that with like Last Spell, Sid Reigns, those kind of things. Earth has a few of those as well. Or a less ideal option, but definitely still an option, is removal EXs. So aggro can get stopped in its tracks if it runs into removal EXs. So obviously they are much less reliable. You're not really in control of hitting them during a game, but that is still an option and a possibility you can open up if you need that. And then besides that, just fill parts of your deck that seem lacking. So if you have a low summon count, maybe you only got 3 or whatever, it's the 3 Diablos you chucked in before, then maybe add some more summons. Or if you have a low amount of neutral plays, you might need some more. And I've mentioned this before, but I'll just reiterate it. Neutral play is a play that you can do basically anytime, and it's fully efficient regardless of the board or whatever's happening. It's just a card, you have some backups, whatever happens, you can just play it, use your mana, that's fine. That's a neutral play. The other one is not enough different names among your unique forwards. So sometimes you only have a few different named forwards. You might need a few more just so you have forwards to play while you already have a board. So, if you have all the same names, then you've got one on board. You can just keep drawing the same ones you have on board. Whereas if you have a few different ones, then you can have your options, basically. And if you can't think of anything you need, you can always just add EXs, right? There are like premium removal EXs in basically every color. You've got like Odin, Atomos, Madius, the 5-cost one or whatever. So if you don't need those slots for anything else, then you can just chuck those in if you want. Like they will just randomly win you some games probably if you just hit them. So that's okay. Like that's fine. And that's generally what Scion decks do, because Scion decks basically only want the Scions. There's not enough of them to fill 50 cards. So after you chuck in some like Iluas and Walls or whatever, what are you gonna do with the other slots? Well, you can put some EXs in, whatever. Now, I said we were going to build a deck together, so that's what we're going to do. But we're going to go back in time. So we are going to go back to the start of Opus 7, sets just released. we've gone through the list of cards. There's been one card that stood out to us. We think this card's going to be really good. So let's build a deck around it. And perhaps unsurprisingly, that card is Yuri. I think a lot of people saw this card and thought this card's really good. I want to build a deck around it. And what we normally do here is go to Mognet and see what cards work well with Yuri and like go through the Opus 7 list and your cards count and everything. I'm not going to go through the motion, but we would obviously come across Chelinka. She's got a good entry ability. She's a legend, so she must be pretty decent. She buffs the damage he does, got this crazy party attack effect. That seems really good. And then, of course, we'd also come across our Hanalem, who has a really good effect. It's a 2-cost backup for starters, so it has no drawback, and it has a really good effect that can be super relevant, even like it's decent enough at base level, but it can be really high rolly, so there's no reason not to play around that. And this is a good like start. This is really good, like clearly an unfair thing that we can do. That's a good thing to base a deck around. And we don't have our elements decided yet. Like we've obviously got wind, but we don't necessarily need to be in mono wind. So now we look for that step 1. Now step 2, support. And direct support is really easy. Again, if we'd gone through the card list, we would have seen this card, which is an EX searcher for Chelinka and Yuri. So we definitely want that. I can put in 3 for now because it is an EX searcher. And then also we're in wind, so we get access to this crazy good card. Obviously, having these 2 forwards out, we want to protect them, like Yuri especially, and the fact that if we manage to get both of them online, we can do the party attack thing. So being able to protect that board is good, so definitely Stoll is a good card here. Now, we'd be thinking, we've got quite a bit of wind, and Yuri likes to have active backups. Our Hanalem would be good if we could use them more than once in a turn, because we can turn those smaller damage packets into something bigger. So something like Bart's would actually be really good. So I'm going to add Bart's. And now we are pretty certain we're in mono wind or mono wind and splash something. So I was talking about damage packets and activating my backups, right? And it turns out that there is a card that does that really well. It's one of the 2 best summons in the game, and that's Valor Starter. So this will work really well with our Hanalem if we can get to activate our backups, because, you know, we can have the 3000 damage, activate this, so we get to do its effect at least twice, so we can deal 7k to just a single target if we have one of them. If we have both of them, we can clear a board really easily like that, and that seems very unfair, super high rolly. So we'll, of course, to trigger the activate backups, we need a card called Una. So we chuck in Una. Now we have to have water, because all the units are water. So we now know that we are going to be mono wind splashing water. This is one of the reasons I brought this up earlier. This looks like quite a good base. Obviously with Una and Valor, I mean, we're in wind, so we can clearly take advantage of this card, which is also really good with Una. And we obviously need a Riku to go with that. So that's another really good unfair card that we have access to. And we want to be able to get to this unit, because the unit obviously activates our Valor, it activates our Pain, and there is an EX searcher for that as well. Unfortunately, it has the same name as the Pain we already have, but we can still add it. And that's also a Gullwing, so we can get to by a backup, Shinra. Oops, I'll probably leave it at 1 for now. And that seems like a really good call. We've got solid, efficient cards. We've got powerful cards. We have good interactions between these cards. We can do a lot of damage, activate a lot of backups. We can do, you know, flexibility of Yuri. That seems like a really good base. This seems like a good core of a deck. Now, step 3, we're going to fill up our backup line. And we're already at 13, which is quite a bit. But I'm not quite happy with 3-ofs in all these, because when I think about it, in a deck that wants a lot of backups out, because we want to be activating them all with like Bart's and Valor and stuff, we probably don't want to double up the names too much. So I might, at this point, consider dropping a couple of these down. Riku, I'm iffy about, because we really do want Pain to just be really good. I can try dropping 1 our Hanalem, and we'll probably drop an Illyria for sure. I'll definitely leave 3 unit. And now we want some backups that we need some more turn 1 backups. So we've already got 8, 9 turn 1 backups and 2 semi-turn 1 backups. But when it comes to wind, the best 2 options for generic ones are usually Archer and White Mage. I'm just going to chuck in Archer, because if nothing else, it gives us the option to kill Minwu, which can stop our like damage packet combos. And we're at 14 now. I reckon, even though we're only splashing water, we usually 3 backups is probably not quite enough. And even though we usually want unit as our water backup, there might be games where we will need another water backup earlier. This is where I would normally go to the list. I would go water backup, 2 and 4 cost. I guess I can chuck in 6 as well, but I already know the only 2 are last round and Filia. And I would go through this list and I would say that I don't really want any of these in particular. Gladiator is usually a good one, but in this case we don't have Viking. Echo is actually a decent option if we have a lot of summons. We can think about that later. But I'm going to see Merwib, and that's a nice generic 2 cost, which is also, like I said before, it's a 4 cost, but it's effective 2 cost, and it's in the color. If we open 2 wind backups, which is very likely, we can play this efficiently turn 3 with a single water discard and use up our backups, and that's really convenient. So I'm going to use that, and it's also an EX on top of that, which is nice. So yeah, that seems like a good additional water backup that we need. And now we're at 17. That's pretty good. But again, I'm not quite happy with all the 3 ofs. I'm actually going to drop 1 Merwib, maybe. I don't think we need 3 copies of that. And I'm going to replace it with another wind backup with a different name, Echo, which basically functions the same as an EX, so we're not losing out on the EX there. It just gives us a different name to play, and it's got some nice synergies with Hanalem. It's kind of cute, all that kind of stuff. So that backup line I'm pretty fine with. I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to leave it at that. Now, number 4, add the generic good cards. And for wind, this is really easy. We already have Ishtola, and we're just going to have Diablos because this card is insane. It's the other best summon in the game. So these 2 are the 2 best summons in the game, in my opinion, and we've got both of them in our deck, so that seems really good. The other one, in Mono Wind, or Mono Wind splashing something, Wind doesn't actually have that many good forwards by itself, so the best one that we have access to is Zidane, and there's actually 2 of them. So we've got the 3 cost Zidane or the 4 cost Zidane. Now, the 3 cost Zidane is very good, it's very consistent, it's very reliable. The 4 cost Zidane is still decently reliable, but it's also much more powerful. So it's less consistent, but it is a much more like high roll card. Like it can do a lot more if it works out, and so I prefer that one personally. I have no problem with the other one, and if you want to play the other one instead, that's fair enough. As for water, there's actually not really any water cards that are basically staple in any water deck. The closest is Cloud of Darkness, but that's usually because Layla and Viking are involved, and we probably don't want to go into Layla, Viking, Cloud of Darkness. That's probably a few too many water cards for our just splashing the water. So that's all for our generic good cards. Now, step 5, we want to fill the holes and cover the weaknesses. And of weaknesses, there doesn't really seem to be any that I can notice right now from looking at this list. We don't have any issue with like untargetable stuff because we have lots of AoE. We don't really have an issue with aggro that much, even though we're quite set-up-y. We do have quite a few ways to punish like lots of forwards. We can, you know, ping them off quite easily with stuff like Chelinka and our Hanalem. We've got the AoE with Valor, which can combine with our Hanalem to really clear a lot of things at once. So I'm actually not too worried about weaknesses right now. But as for filling the holes, clearly we need more water cards. We only have 5, and I would like to aim for about 12. That's like a nice baseline for like a splash element. And we'd go through the water cards. I would just go like this, forward summon the monster. And I mean, I can go through and tell you what's going through my head, but basically what would happen is I would see Halicarnassus, I would see Cloud of Darkness, I would see Porom, I would see Steiner, the other Steiner, which can search the Dane, and that's maybe Ash. So those are probably the forwards that I would take note of as like decent generic water forwards. Porom's an EX, so I'm just going to chuck Porom in. Like, when in doubt, if you don't need anything in particular, EXs are always good, assuming you don't need a slot for something else. So that's an easy one to chuck in. And also, we've got this Una in our backup line, but we're not even using its effect right now, so we probably want some kind of water summon. And again, there's a lot of water cards have EXs for no reason, and one of them is Kuchulain. And this will actually help our help combine with these damage that we're doing. We can lower things' power to make that damage kill them. That's pretty good too. And again, you know, extra EX, extra draw cards. We've got a lot of EXs in this deck. That's like really nice to have that without actually really going out of our way. Like a lot of these cards we wanted to play anyway, and we just happen to have 19 EXs. So that's awesome. And that's one of the benefits of Water Wind, and one of the reasons Water Wind is so universal and has been around for so long is because it does get a lot of power just from having EXs for no reason. That's 48 cards, so that's heaps. We only need 2 extra cards. I probably want 1 more water card, and I'm feeling like, personally, I would probably take Cloud of Darkness because I love the card and I think it's really good. And again, the neg power effect works really well with a lot of the stuff we can do. So even if we're not getting full, you know, neg 8k, which is usually the line that you want to be hitting, because we don't have Layla Viking, so that's going to be less likely. We do have, you know, damage lying around from Valor or Hanalem that can combine up. So even 6 or like 4k could even work out for us. So I'm fine with Cloud of Darkness. And we need one more card. Could put in another water card, but I'm actually going to chuck in a single barb. She's normally comes in at this slot of the deck because she's like an additional extra name that goes well with the kind of stuff that wind often does. If this looks familiar, that's because it probably is. Not coincidentally, this is 48 cards identical to Rob Phillips's winning list from Grand Open Bologna in January. The reason I chose to use this as an example rather than a weird non-meta idea, which is where I spend most of my time later in the format, is because I wanted to demonstrate that not only can this method help build those weird or interesting decks, it also applies to meta decks. And that can potentially give you a very strong deck off the bat. So hopefully this motivates you that you can build a really strong deck, a really strong new deck when Opus 8 comes out. Just some closing remarks. Many cards are below the average power level that I mentioned earlier. So while the card pool is technically over like 1,000 cards, the amount to choose from in deck building is probably less than half. And the reason I bring this up, it sounds like I'm just saying, don't play bad cards. And to an extent I am. But what I really mean is, remember there's a reason that some cards never see play. And of course, don't just discount every card that you never see played. But I'll always try to promote trying new things for yourself. Of course, what I'm emphasizing though is don't feel bad when those cards don't work out in testing. And don't ignore a card's shortcomings just to be different. These are some examples that I have seen in people's decks. And they're in there for a reason. And that's fine. But the cards themselves are just so bad, their base power level is so low that they won't be good enough. The last point, which is also very, very important, deck building doesn't end at the initial build. Naturally, you should always be looking for ways to improve your deck via testing and adapting to the way the meta changes. The most important thing I can emphasize here is that when you're testing, your goal isn't to win the game. It's to discover what about your deck works and what could be improved. You should definitely try to win, but that's not so you can say I won. That's so you can gain the most meaningful information to improve your deck so that it is the best it can be when you're at an event and the result does matter. So that point, if you take nothing else away, take the point that while you're testing, the most important thing is that you are learning about your deck and that you are looking for ways to improve your deck. That's all for that. So thank you very much for watching, everyone. I know this is a really long one, but I actually spent quite a bit of time on this, and I just want to say that I never sat down and like when I started playing TCGs or FF or anything, I never sat down and was like, I'm gonna figure out a method to build a deck and then I'm gonna follow that. Like, that's not what this is. I've just developed habits and ways I go about deck building as I've played over the years, and this was me trying to basically condense that or quantify that into steps that can be followed, and it actually ends up pretty close to what I do. Obviously sometimes I'll interchange the steps, like I'll add some generic good cards in step 2 or whatever just because they're there, etc. But like I said again, this is my way of doing it. This is not there's no definitive way to build decks. I just hope that something in here has helped someone with deck building, whether it be all the steps or just like one tiny little thing that I mentioned that maybe someone hasn't thought about. Anyway, thank you everyone again for watching, and I intend to release more videos, hopefully more like strategy videos and about like better, more wider concepts than just, specifically deck profiles, although I'll still do those of course as well, and I'll also be streaming more as usual. So thanks again and cheers everyone.